I always forget that I can't minimize. Well, alrighty. Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. Welcome to our last conversations of the curator for the year. We've done this for a whole year, and what a year it has
We've made
been.
a habit out of it.
Stay tuned for more shenanigans in 2025. So today we are going to be looking into Victorian mourning customs. As you can see behind Tim's head, that is a rather large Victorian hair wreath. So before we even get into the mourning customs themselves, let's start with a little bit about the Victorian era just in general. So much to go into there, but we only have an hour.
I was gonna say, how much time do we have?
Zoom will kick us off before long. How would you characterize this period? Like its overarching values? What are the contexts that the mourning customs came out of?
Sure. And I mean, so first of all, calling it the Victorian, right? That kind of is interesting because we Americans use that a lot.
Right.
Right? Like the Victorian era, the Victorians, Victorian houses, Victorian morals, etc. But like that is a very specific thing of which we are not a part.
Right.
We had a revolution after all about
yes.
that. So that is of course evoking Queen Victoria, right? The Victorian era of the mid-19th, so most of the 19th century, right? Which is really that time that for Britain is the high point of the British Empire. Really, that is Victoria's British Empire is the sun, the empire upon which the sun never sets. Empress of India, etc.
The irony of that name is something I never put
together. Truly.
Wow.
But us calling it that, so me saying it's not our world, it is true, but it's also, there's more complicated than that, right? Because I think when we talk about the Victorian era, we're really talking about a shared group of customs, social ideas, spread of information, print culture. If I'm to, evoke where we're going next in exhibits that we're doing. Between the United States and Great Britain. It's the beginnings of what will eventually become the special relationship, right? Between the United States and Great Britain. So it's really the shared Anglo-American set of customs and values. But what about the Victorians, right? So for people in the 19th century broadly, right, especially in the British/American world. It is and this is all tied to class, right? So of course we should mention that, right? But if you're like higher status class people, there are social customs and mores that are considered to be important that you uphold. Class is highly stratified, right? Both in Britain and the United States. That is tied to customs that dictate how you should behave, right? I think a lot of times people talk about of things that people say about the quote unquote Victorians, right? It's like they're prudish and they don't want people to like look at the table legs, hence they get an idea, right? But like that's not true. They really inherently weren't. They were very not. They were very gregarious about a lot of these things, right? So like so we have social stratification, we have the idea of the role you play in society, we have the idea of morality in a way, but a lot of that is performative, right? There's that kind of element of performativeness to that because we also see this is the era of social stratification that leads to the upper classes and the lower classes, right? This is the, rise of child labor, which had of course been a thing forever, but really kind of with the rise of industrialization, more on that in a second, child labor in machines and factories, right? It is this era of quote unquote enlightenment, but also this era of not so much.
Workhouses and
Were the workhouses,
cholera.
are there no workhouses? Ebenezer Scrooge yells, right? And it's
Yeah.
kind of that war of cholera, of
Mhm.
the rise of cities and the rise of disease and epidemic. And
Mhm.
of course, this is before vaccination
Right.
and I guess widely done or believed in.
Mhm.
So, without that, you have the rapid spread of disease and death.
I mean, we don't get the germ theory until what, the 1890s or
Exactly.
something?
Yeah, the end of this era. The other thing about it, which I think is part of our story here, if we're talking about mourning customs and dealing with death, we have the all these social stratifications, we have the ways that you live, all these sorts of things, but we also have technology.
Mhm.
The 19th century is the beginnings of electronics,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
It's the beginnings of Morse code. It's the beginnings of the wiring of houses for
Mhm.
like it's the beginning of what becomes our electric world,
Mhm.
right? So we have this kind of really rapidly changing world
Mhm.
that brings with it all sorts of things, new ways to see the world,
Mhm.
people who are doing new inventions, new grifts, new ways that we interact with society and ourselves. But at the same time, it is kind of meeting, like the Victorian era is the end of really the end of empires, really, right? In a
yeah.
broad European sense, right? Like the Spanish had their shot and had it for centuries and they have collapsed. The
Mhm.
French have had their shot and they've collapsed into their own revolution.
Mhm.
The English have it and they're collapsing. And then maybe we're seeing like the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th, they're seeing like the rise of an American empire, probably, right? If we're going to
Mhm.
call it that.
Mhm.
But yeah, so it's this,
The British lose India?
the British lose India.
Yeah.
The
Oh, not lose, like it's not a lot, yeah.
Americans gain the Philippines, right?
Hmm, yeah.
So it is the an era of contradictions,
Mhm.
which is a short answer to what was becoming a very ungainly longer answer, right? It is tied to the old ways, but times are rapidly changing and
Mhm.
technology is
Mhm.
rapidly changing.
And the questions that obviously we're asking ourselves today, how do we adjust to that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's like we live in a time of rapid technological change exponential,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like in our lifetimes and in the last 100 years, but not 100, well, in the last 100 years, certainly, but in the last,
Well,
in the last 10 years, which feels
Oh,
like 100
gosh.
years, right?
Yeah.
Rapid change, right? But that rapid change starts in the 19th century, I would say. And it's a lot of the things they were grappling with are things we're grappling with now.
Mhm.
Our questions are different
Mhm.
at their base level, but
Mhm.
the gist of them is still the same.
Yeah. Almost like it's our job to find those patterns.
Almost like it is, yeah.
Weird.
History rhymes in a way,
Whole field of study for that.
right?
Yeah. So in talking about all the different, now I'm saying spheres and I'm imagining like astronomy spheres.
Yeah, let's not get
above our heads.
spheres of influence or
Different.
something.
Yeah.
That'll turn the whole thing, yeah.
Zoom will kick us off before we finish that one.
Yeah.
So pulling into the hair wreaths themselves, this is I want to say spherical project in the sense that it was confined to like a very particular subset and era,
Mhm.
but not era, area.
Right.
Area. It's very domestic.
It's
in a
absolutely,
way.
it's
So,
absolutely exceptionally domestic,
and
which
it's very social.
very social,
Yeah.
which maybe for the sake of everyone being on the same page, I should show some examples of what this is outside of my talking about it. Let me
Mhm.
share the screen. I think it's letting me do
There we
that. Are we seeing my PowerPoint?
There we go.
Okay.
If I can.
So
Full screen.
a thing that I do, and this is a fact about myself, is we've talked about this in previous history conversation with the curator. I'm very into the idea of historic practices.
Mhm.
My book is about that.
Mhm.
And really my book is in part about hair wreaths. So that's
Mhm.
kind of how I got to this,
Okay.
which is the idea of mourning jewelry or hair worked objects exist.
Mhm.
And what do we do with them?
Mhm.
What can they tell us about the past?
Mhm.
A thing I think is important to note is that the keeping of hair as a memento of a dead loved one or a dead person, that is a long trajectory. So I'm showing you a thing that is a subset of other things that I could talk about forever. I'm fascinated by them, which is a relic of a saint in the Catholic Church, right? There are different kinds of relics connected to saints, people that the church says are in heaven with God. And relics are, long story short, and long and complicated answer short, relics are connected to a saint, a person's body, something they touched or the body themselves. This is from 1253, give or take, and that's the year that she died, so it's probably around then. These are hair clippings from St. Clare of Assisi, another resident of Assisi. Many people probably know St. Francis of there. But this is her hair in a box, right? In Catholic belief, this is a relic of her body, and because of its presence, provides a way to interact with her, which her as an intermediary to God, right? But this is keeping her, an element of her body as a remembrance of her, really, as this holy object.
Is it a common, since you have more experience in this, is it common for it to be in that good of condition?
Yeah, her hair is pretty,
it doesn't like degrade.
Hair will degrade, but hair lasts for a really long time. Usually if you're thinking of things that don't decay, that decay at a slower rate, the human body. And we can do a whole thing about decay kind of in a little bit, because I think that's actually part of this. Things that don't decay are, or will decay, but will decay at a much slower rate, are hair and teeth. So just as a aside, bones can degrade at a different rate than teeth. And this is, of course, so the hair here is being kept in a special box. It will be called a reliquary. That's a whole other thing. Here is and this is connected to relics themselves, right? But this is a locket with the hair of King Charles I in it. Charles I was a British monarch, who is two Charleses ahead of the current Charles III. But Charles I is beheaded by Cromwell. That's a whole other thing, right? So this is a keeping of the locket from a lock of his hair to commemorate him, the king, right? It's really this kind of object that would be kept by a follower or a sympathizer or a monarchist, and keeping this element of the king's hair to show proximity to the king's body, as it were. And that idea of the king's body is a whole other thing, because it's like in absolute monarchies, the idea of the king's body is actually a stand-in for the state. That's a whole thing that is an aside. Yeah, here's a lock of George Washington's hair, of which there's a bunch. This one's at Mount Vernon, but famously locally, there is a lock of hair that was taken from George Washington by a Moravian girl. So people collect hair of all sorts of celebrity people or noteworthy people. So there's George Washington's hair. Here's the locks of Percy and Mary Shelley, which I had a hunch you would enjoy, Sarah. The Percy and Mary Shelley there together in the little hair box. Yeah, there they are together. BFFs. This is from the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This is the hair of Mrs. Gabrielle Mangault on a miniature portrait. Miniature portraits are something that could be painted and worn like on, your person. And the front of it is a portrait of her, and she looks kind of like, starry-eyed. And it's a really kind of odd little portrait, I think. And then the back of it is a woven object of her hair. So note on hair worked objects in general here, because now we're getting into like 1795 is what like we weird history people call part of the long 19th century, probably, right? Because it's like coming out of the 19th century. But hair worked objects, which is to say objects made out of hair in the 19th century are made for a variety of reasons. They can be made as a mourning token to mourn the loss of a deceased person, which is kind of how we're coming into it today. They can be given as a token of love and affection to someone you are in a relationship with, to someone you want to be in a relationship with. Nothing says, hey, let's date, then here, have some of my hair. Yeah, it's a wild thing
We've
to
come
do.
so far.
It can be a collection of hair from a family to commemorate, right? But it does not necessarily. Oh, and the other, like, it can be given between friends too. Like, it doesn't have to be a romantic gesture. It can be like this very kind of friendly giving of hair pieces. But really, what it is that you are keeping, preserving, and or in some way interacting with hair from a loved one. Sometimes that loved one is dead when you use the hair or you have the hair. Sometimes that loved one is very much not dead. But any of these objects are artworks, definitely, made with the hair of a person. So they're made with human hair. This is what's behind me. If you can see me, you can see probably the bottom of that. This is a hair wreath from our collection, the NCHGS collection, 19th century. Everything you can see in there, all of those flowers, all that cross on the top, the leaves of it, all of it is hair, human hair. This hair wreath is probably a collection of various different hair, given that there are hairs of various colors, anywhere from very white to gray to brown, and there's some black, and there's actually some auburn in there as well. There's a whole collection of hair. So this is probably a mourning wreath, but is really a wreath that is hair from a whole family and put together in one context. This hair wreath is actually, I'm into them, right? This is our hair wreath is a very good hair wreath. It's in very large. It's very large, not necessarily uncommonly large, but it's very large, and it is in really good shape.
What do we know about that other than 19th century?
Very little, unfortunately. A lot of them, sometimes they'll be labeled on the back, like by the family that makes them, like whose hair is in use in it. Sometimes the actual wreath itself will be labeled, like this hair is made from Johnny's hair or something like that. Like this flower is made from, but this one, not so much. It's just kind of a object, and really that 19th century, almost assuredly post-Civil War, but other than that, boo. Agreed. Yeah. You can also see the creation, and this is very similar to what we saw with George Washington's hair, very similar to what we saw even with the Shelley's hair. This is a brooch with hair in it, and this is hair that is placed, and it is glued down with a kind of all-purpose historical glue known as gum arabic, which is really a kind of glue made from tree sap, long story short. And it's kind of put down and, arranged, and then it dries solidly in there, and then you cover it with glass and you wear it as your little brooch. My slides got out of whack. This is what some of those hair worked flowers could look like. To make these, as we talked about kind of when we were talking about my book a couple months ago, I guess that's the March one, maybe. The hair wreaths are made using wire and hair. And really, ultimately, what you do is you wrap the hair around a dowel, and then you braid the wire on top of it. So really what you're doing is looping the hair, and you're using the wire to hold it in place. And you can take it and bend it. Hair wreaths like the one we have are made using that kind of same basic pattern over and over again. You can also make stuff
Whoa.
like this. That is hair. Yeah, I mean, there's parts of it that are gold, and there's like a lovely little part of it that's turquoise and maybe like garnets, but probably some sort of costume jewelry. But this is a bracelet that would be worn, right? And like that whole coil
Mhm.
is hair.
How does that hold up?
It's woven like any other kind of textile, right? So
Uh-huh.
it kind of has some give to it, but it's truly an astounding thing. These objects, right, and to kind of okay. Mark Campbell's the self-instructor in the art of hair work, dressing hair, making curls, switches, braids, and hair jewelry of every description. This published by Mark Campbell in 1867. There he is with his delightful mutton chops and his braiding table and in position to braid. This answers that question that got you asked that got me to go on this little tirade about the different kinds of hair work that could be made, which is to say hair work was part of, as I mentioned, a variety of reasons you could have hair work done.
Mhm.
Hair work as an object of mourning
Mm.
connected to the death of a loved one is made via two avenues.
Mm.
It is made by either Avenue 1, which is sending the hair to someone that does that work,
Okay.
a worker of hair,
Mhm.
who will you basically pick out a pattern, send the hair,
Mhm.
they make the thing, send it back to you. It's a trade that people would do. The other way you can do it, which I always find kind of infinitely more interesting, if I might say so,
Mhm.
this is something that is taught and done in the home.
Yes.
So Mark Campbell's The Self-Instructor in the Art of Hair Work is a 19th century instruction manual for how you make hair work.
Mhm.
Actually, what Mark Campbell's Self-Instructor, what it's really good for
Mhm.
is making stuff like that braided snake
Oh.
bracelet.
Mhm.
Because really what he does, and when you flip through it, I think I have the, yeah. So it
Mhm.
shows like this is how you arrange them and how you
Mhm.
braid it to make
Mm.
an object.
Mhm.
I would say, like, for people listening at home, if you've done something that looks like making bobbin lace, where it's like bobbin lace, you have like a bunch of thread and it's all different like bobbins, and you move it in such a way that you're
Mhm.
making lace, right? It's how
Aha,
traditionally you
okay.
make lace.
Yeah.
This is very similar to
Mm.
that in kind of how it's done.
Mhm.
But this is work that will be done in the home.
Mhm.
And this is work that would fall into, even though it's written by Mark Campbell,
Mhm.
and even though the professional people who you'd send it
Mhm.
to do it would probably be men,
Mm.
this work in the home is women's work. It is usually, I mean, I'm sure there are men that have done it, right? But
Mhm.
this would fall into the work of work that women would do.
Mhm.
Almost assuredly our hair wreath, though we don't know for sure. So again, this is a guessing here.
Mhm.
Almost assuredly it's made by women.
That is kind of where I'm leading with the physical aspect of the making. What would that look like? Say if you have women in one family or friends of women gathering together to do this. What does that kind of a day look like?
It's communal, right? It's
Mhm.
communal work. It is you are getting together and you are doing it together. Once you and I've now done like we did a workshop I guess that was last month, where we did hair work here, right?
That was this month.
Is that this
That
month?
was this month.
Oh, wow. We did it in the recent past. We
Yes.
did a hair work workshop, and
Good times had by
good
all.
times. And it was usually by the end of it, people kind of figure out that basic process I talked about, where it's you wrap it around and you do it.
Mhm.
Once you have that figured out,
Mhm.
it is pretty self-explanatory.
Mm.
And by self-explanatory, I mean you can do it and you can talk. You
Okay.
don't, it doesn't require your full
Mhm.
attention. So it's very similar to how like sewing or like doing kind of stitch work or
Mhm.
something like that,
Mhm.
right? Like, so once you do it, it could definitely be something you could like sit in a group
Okay.
and be doing together.
Mhm.
So I think we should absolutely see the making of these as communal.
Mhm.
And I think that's an important part of it.
Mhm. We can't have a conversation about this without mentioning the Civil War. Right.
No,
That's, yeah. Again, for two people who are not Civil War scholars, we sure talk about it quite a lot.
I know we should,
It's a little
I
funny.
feel like I should read more about it.
I mean, this is undisputably a pretty significant thing
Of course
that
it is. Yeah,
happened.
of course
Like,
it is. Of course.
just because we're not good at it doesn't mean it's not.
We're okay. I think we're okay with it.
We're okay. I
Yeah.
find it interesting. I'm
Yeah.
not going to dedicate my field of study to it, but how does the Civil War shape what the Victorians come to call the good death?
Right. So
And how does the hair making align with that?
how does it align with that? Okay, so the Civil War was, exceptionally violent and exceptionally close,
Yes.
right? It's happening here.
Mhm.
We have, of course, had war here, right? We had revolution, war before that, like the so-called French Indian War, the Revolution, the War of 1812, various rebellion, but
Nothing quite on this scale.
nothing quite on this scale. And the thing about the Civil War was it was like us against us, right? It's a civil war. It's
That's
internal.
Yes.
And it was exceptionally local, especially like, I mean, the high water mark, like the battle that turns the tide happens in Pennsylvania, right? In Gettysburg, right?
Yes.
So it is local for this part of the country, exceptionally, right?
And especially for us, as we just did. Is that July or August that we did?
We did the Connolly letters. I think that was August, give or take.
Okay, I'm so sorry. We don't know what time is anymore.
Yeah, it was in the past, farther in the past than the hair workshop, but not quite that much in the past. But yeah, so it is exceptionally local. Also, there's technology happening, right?
Yes.
So
much more so than in any of the other previous.
Much more so than in any of the others. It's going to become a constant thing, right? Like the story of the First World War is technology, really. It is a old style war fought globally using new technology, which is,
Which you could still see the effects of.
Absolutely. It's absolutely devastating, right? But like the Civil War is photographed. It is, reported in almost real time. It is, hard to remove from the American consciousness, as it were. With that comes the kind of omnipresence of death, right? Death in battle, death afterwards, death is this kind of specter. The thing I often think about, and I forget where I read this, but I know I read it somewhere that is true or true-ish, is that, the Battle of Gettysburg happens at the beginning of July. And there's accounts, because of course, and there's the famous photographs taken by Gardner and Sullivan of bodies on the battlefield of Gettysburg. And of course, those are documentary because it's new photography and they're taking pictures, but of course, it's also somewhat manufactured because they're moving bodies around to make better photos and like posing people, and it's a whole thing. But somewhere in all that, right? So they're taking these photographs and people are seeing them, but you just think of what it would be like to be going to Gettysburg. Because there's an account, I think it's the end of July, where people are getting to Gettysburg and they know they're getting close because they can smell the bodies rotting in the field, right? It's horrific. And it is, and just going into that is to stress the horrificness and the closeness and
for a Was it the bloodiest battle? Is that,
I mean, it was
they're
bloody,
arguably all
you know,
bloody,
they're all,
but I
yeah,
mean,
so it's a
if you've
matter
been to
of,
Gettysburg, you know, it's not a big place.
it's not a big place, no, it's not. But the fallout from that
Mhm.
shapes the American relationship with death,
Mhm.
I think, in a very solid way.
Mhm.
So, you know, shapes our conceptualization of death, shapes how we interact with death, shapes how we talk about death, shapes how we mourn, changes how we do all of those things as
Mhm.
well. So that idea of the good death is a 19th century construction,
Mhm.
right? Where you are to die, and it goes deeper, right? It
Mhm.
exists in the 18th century.
Mhm.
I always think there's a painting, Benjamin West,
Mm.
of Battle of Quebec, and it
Mhm.
shows General Wolfe, and he's just been shot,
Mhm.
and he's like swooning. You know, he's been shot. In battle would really hurt, right?
Mhm.
But he's swooning on the battlefield, and like the light of the heavens is shining down on him. It's this kind of classic 18th century history painting. But like, that's a good death.
Mhm.
He is dying honorably.
Mhm.
He is
Mhm.
dying
Mhm.
not concerned about what will happen to him after it.
Mm.
He is not, you know, he is, it's an acceptance. It is you know, it's meeting death in it's the word I'm searching for here, in a like moral way, but also
okay.
in a, like there's an element of politeness and gentility too, right?
Mhm.
Like you're meeting death as a civilized quote unquote person.
Gotcha.
So it's like that whole idea that like there are good ways and bad ways to die is not necessarily tied to the way in which you die,
Mhm.
right? It is tied to how you meet it when it happens.
Mm.
So yeah, so that's of course like part of it, right? Because
Mhm.
part of what the Civil War was about, I mean, like in the South especially, but like up here is
Mhm.
gentility, right?
Mhm.
Is society, is the maintenance of social structure, right? So it's like you're supposed to die and die well.
Mhm.
When that was kind of a reinforcement of that, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it's in thinking, in a lot of my own work, we talk about ambiguous loss, that you might know that perhaps someone has died, but you don't know the conditions, and the human condition that, you know, we all know is we want answers.
Right.
We want,
Yeah. Oh,
we
yeah.
want explanations,
Yes.
and we want to, even more so for, you know, knowing that the other person went comfortably or whatever, we want to pacify ourselves also as part of that equation, right?
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
So how, in which sense, I guess, is the better phrase? No. Sorry, can you see the gears
I was
turning
gonna say,
over my head
gears
right
are
now?
really going, yeah.
Yeah, we're trying here, guys. How does the making of a hair wreath sort of intersect, or I guess the word that how is it a practice of ensuring a good death?
Sure. So I actually think I'm of the belief, and someday when I finish my dissertation and can write stuff that's not that, I want to work on something about this.
Okay.
I think you can't not talk about hair wreaths and not talk about technology. That those two things sound paradoxical to each other, but they actually aren't, right? So what a hair wreath is you are tangibly using your fingers, and if you are making a hair wreath to mourn a deceased loved one, you are using your fingers to weave their hair in your hands. It's allowing a space to mourn, right? It is allowing you to tangibly interact with that person's body. It is creating an object to remember them by. But I think I think what's more important to the hair wreath is the process. Like, I think it's about the process, and the finished object is kind of secondary.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, right? But
easy for you to say in front of this.
Easy for me to say as I sit in
gorgeous
front of
work,
this
yeah.
gorgeous thing, right? But it's it's about the process. And like for us as modern people, that's sometimes hard to do because we are very focused on finished thing. So like a lot of like
quickly finished
things. So a lot of like my work talking about historic trade and craft as something we should talk about. It's often about the finished thing, but it's often not, right? It's about how you get there and how you pass on that information, right? The folklore of making is something I say a lot, right?
That's nice.
Technology shifts the relationship with death, right?
Okay.
So there are ways that technology preserves the person. Death photography, right? This whole boom of in the 19th century, photographers going and taking pictures of people who are dead, mostly in coffins. There's kind of this like broad belief that it's like people propped up in chairs and kind of all that. There's actually less of those than we say there is, or people say there is, in part because there's all these like little mechanisms that are used to like supposedly prop up bodies in chairs, but actually what they are is to prop up people in chairs, because if you're taking a picture in the 19th century, you can't move for a while, right? And if there's a thing that a body's good at, it's not moving, right? So you just kind of, they don't need that, right? So a lot of those so-called devices for taking pictures of dead people sitting in chairs are just for taking pictures of living people sitting in chairs. But with the rise of death photography, you are preserving a loved one, right? Death photography very often kind of falls in the way that people talk about that hair wreaths, which is this is a gross thing, right? Taking a picture of these dead people, it's a weird thing to do. Hair wreath, it's hair, it's yucky, it's a gross thing, right? But they are both these really meditative things about death, right? Death photography uses a new technology to sometimes take a picture, the only picture of a person that exists, right? Because it's like photography in its infancy, and like photography when it becomes like widely available to regular people, and like very often that's the only picture of that person. And hair wreaths are this actual act of preserving, but the act of preserving that actually changed everything, and what I think made hair wreaths all the more important, is with the Civil War comes the rise of embalming, right? So embalming was used not for everyone, but for people that could afford it, to embalm the bodies of people who died on the battlefield in the Civil War, and to ship them back. It's the rise of what we would think of as funereal embalming. So it starts off as like, there are people and we're going to, like their families can pay for them to not be buried in a mass grave on the battlefield. So they're going to be embalmed, because you have to do something to move a body, right? Either refrigerate or embalm. So they're going to embalm them and then ship them on entrance, right? This becomes more accepted after Lincoln dies or is assassinated, and Lincoln is embalmed, and Lincoln goes on his extensive funeral tour, right? The funeral train going through like all of the cities in the Northeast, right? Really, essentially, to lay Lincoln to rest. And as they're doing that, and there's pictures of this actually that are astounding pictures. They're stopping in various cities. They are laying Lincoln in state, and they're opening there's pictures of Lincoln in his coffin, like significantly after he had died, and he looks great, right? So Lincoln was embalmed, dead, but he looks great. And Lincoln was embalmed, and then people start doing that, right? And of course, 19th century embalming and modern embalming, right? It uses a variety of chemicals, arsenic, arsenic, various things like that, that in 19th century cemeteries, it ends up being a problem for like runoff and water, right? So you can end up with high concentrations of that in the groundwater.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I never thought about that, did you? But the other part about that, it's like, before that, historically, if someone died, that happened at home, it still would do that in the 19th century, it still can today, right? But like historically, someone would die, their family would dress them or care for the body. Maybe an undertaker would come and like help them put them in a coffin,
Mhm.
something like that.
Mhm.
But with the rise of embalming comes
Mhm.
the rise of funeral specialists that are
Mm,
going to do the work of embalming. Right?
okay.
They're going to embalm the person. For starters, that starts happening at home, right? They'll do
Mm.
that in the home.
Mhm.
Then they'll, have what we will call a viewing in the
Mhm.
living room, right?
Mhm.
The parlor.
Mhm.
And then that is the rise of the funeral parlor, where there's a separate business that does that. And you go,
Uh-huh.
you leave your home and you go do that
Mhm.
at the funeral parlor,
Mhm.
which is then the body goes there and is preserved there. And then the funeral happens there and it happens outside of the home. So as technology changes, what that means is interaction with the dead
Mhm. Mhm.
becomes increasingly separated from regular living, right?
Mhm.
It becomes specialized, it becomes technology, like part of technology, because
Mhm.
embalming is a technology, right?
Right.
It becomes kind of focused on this idea of the preserving of the body, which is a very tangible thing, right?
Mhm.
Like the body wants to decay.
Mhm.
Even as you're alive, the body is slowly,
Well,
right? Yeah. But
the human condition.
human condition, there it is, that's a whole other thing we could, but what that means, it's like, think of those people that are like making hair wreaths in a world that is totally changing people's
Mhm.
relationship with death, right?
Mm.
And what they are doing is having this moment to make these
Mhm.
objects to mourn.
Mhm.
And I think part of the reason we think them as so like, or broadly, because I obviously don't think of them as strange. I think they're fascinating and
Right.
wonderful. But people broadly find hair wreaths very unsettling, right?
Mm.
I think because it's human hair and that
Mhm.
creeps people out, right? But like, because it's like, oh, they're very fascinated with the death. They're very this morbid thing. But really it's like us, they're very strange, right? Because like we have separated ourselves and sterilized death and
Mhm.
made it such this thing that happens separately, and like you take care of it separately, and you take a day or two off from work and then you go back to work
Yep.
and you pretend like nothing happened, right? So like
Yeah.
we kind of have sterilized it, and we've like everything in the modern world kind of put it in a nice little box,
Yep.
right? And like I think why people find hair wreaths unsettling is because they're not doing that, right? They are
Yeah.
this acknowledgement of loss and then a coping with that loss
Mhm.
in a way that's much more healthy than like broadly healthy than like a modern relationship with
Right.
it, right?
Yeah. So as this question is gonna bring us back to what does that mean for us today? As historians and as everyday people who also cope with tragedy and loss, and as I hate saying we live in a society, but we live in a society where social media changes daily. There's always something new, some new platform coming, some new tweak that, we scroll through Twitter and there's a
X now.
over my dead body. Well, I call it X. That doesn't mean anything. But we scroll through social media and we just see images of death, and then
Yeah.
we keep scrolling and the image after that is a cute puppy.
Right.
How, I guess more so in a society that I don't want to say is more immune to seeing it because we just see it so often and
Right.
so regularly.
Right.
But what do these customs mean? Like, how can we use them in a society where the technology has just advanced so rapidly to a degree that someone making that thing in 1870 would be unfathomable to
Right.
them?
Yeah, because I mean, like we live in a world where literally you can take a deceased loved one's text messages, emails, text they have written, etc., and so forth. You can
Mhm.
put it into a artificial, like an AI program that then you can create ultimately a chat bot. But you didn't expect me to say chat bot, but a chat bot where you can have a text conversation with a dead person and it's a convincing thing, right? Like that is the thing I said there. That sounds like science fiction, but that's real, Like
Yeah.
that exists in the
Yeah,
world now.
yeah.
You can do it. You could actually do it pretty easily, I think.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, I remember the first time, I think it was the guy that was taking old portraits and making them move, and he was making like Thomas Jefferson move
yeah,
and
that's
talk.
wildly unsettling, right? But
I mean, we think it's wildly unsettling. Somebody 50 years from now is gonna be like, "What, you can't talk to grandma? You just
yeah,
don't talk to grandma?"
so I think
It's
there's two answers to this, right?
Mhm.
Answer one is I think technology, like death is a human condition,
Mhm.
right? It is the price of living.
We all gonna do
we
it.
all have to do it,
Yeah.
unfortunately,
Yeah.
but we have to do it. And I think the thing about it, that's been true for all of human history.
Everyone ever.
And technology is not new, right? Like we think of technology as just like computers and like widgets and all of this, but like technology is ancient. The wheel is technology, right? So it's like the Egyptians making mummies as a way of preserving the body so you can have immortality. That's technology,
Yeah.
right? So I think like our relationship with the death, with the dead, death, and the caring of the dead has always been connected to technology, right? Because I think it's just inherent in it, right?
Yeah.
So I think there is this element of like, as our technology evolves, so too is, there is always an application for death, right?
Right.
It just kind of fits in that, right? But I think like the thing about what hair wreaths can do, and it's like this isn't me saying like everyone should make a hair wreath for their dead loved one, though like maybe that's a good idea. I think partly it is purposefulness, right? It is acceptance. It is allowing a space to deal with it, right? Because we're very, very bad at that as a society. And we're bad at that in dealing with personal loss, and we're bad at that at dealing with like big loss, like big existential problem.
Right.
We're very bad at that, right? So I think like what a hair wreath is, because it's like I think like the makers of hair wreaths, of course, had these same like existential concerns and all that we all do, right? But like I think they're also like providing a space to accept it as something that's real, right? Because I think like a lot of how we as modern people interact with death is, talk about it, you talk about it in hushed tones, you use little euphemisms, you don't talk about like, people are uncomfortable talking about like what they want to happen to them and their body and their remains and their goods and all that stuff, right? And I think it's all this avoidance, right? And it's like ultimately you can't avoid it. It's just is, right? So I think it's like ultimately accepting it. And I think it's partly what a hair wreath does. And it's like in like a more philosophical way, it is preserving a object of a person, but it's also like an acknowledgement that like the rest of that person can be preserved, right? It is, we are the body anyway, and like we won't as historians, we won't speak on matters theological or spiritual, but like the body is the body is finite,
Right.
the body decays, the body goes away, and that's what it's meant to do. That's the circle of life, as Simba had said, right? But a hair wreath is an acknowledgement of that fact, right? And I think like a lot of our modern relationship with death and like an embalming, it's like this, when you go to a viewing for someone that's died, it's a very strange and surreal experience because you're seeing that person that you knew in life there, and they're dead, and they, people look varying degree, like it varies how the success of it, right? But
Even
like
generally just like as a whole, I think that seeing other people going through the mourning process very openly makes us uncomfortable.
absolutely, it makes me uncomfortable. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Agreed, yeah. But part of like what embalming does and like what modern funeral industry does, it's like pitching the idea of like this preservation of a memory picture, right? Like that someone is like they'll look like that forever in their
Mm.
special hermetically sealed coffin, right? Because it's like this idea that like water can't get in this,
Ah,
coffin with all these seals and all.
mhm.
But like that's all just this like reluctance to acknowledge
Mm.
fragility and
Right.
reluctance to acknowledge decay,
Right.
right, as part of life. So I think like what hair reads and these kind of mourning things and like why they're important, it's because they're an acknowledgement that we're finite, right? They're an acknowledgement that we rot, right? And they're an acknowledgement
It's
that,
gonna get ugly.
and they're an acknowledgement that that's true and that's fine because it's kind of unavoidable,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, like I think that's important, and I think that's like what that doing that historical work does. Because I mean, like insert here people in the past were people too, etc. So
Yeah, it's just something,
something that, yeah.
Yeah, and the community aspect of it, like, I'm thinking of like practicing Day of the Dead in Mexico. It's
Absolutely.
not something you do by yourself. That's the opposite of the point.
Exactly.
Yeah, right, you're supposed to come together as a community and mourn.
Mhm.
But also to celebrate what that person was
Absolutely.
and acknowledge, like, that's what the, the image of the skeleton and the ridiculous garb and the hats, it's like, yeah, we're all gonna die. But like, no matter who you are, no matter how rich you are, or how many fancy hats you own, you too are going to be a corpse in the ground.
Mhm. Which of course was like when they're making those images of, that's a whole thing, because it's like tied to like the Mexican Revolution and all this, right? Like,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's true, because it's like
Yeah.
Day of the Dead is like acknowledgement that that's an essential human condition,
Right,
and
right.
like,
Right, even the religiosity of it aside, like.
which is like that's all we could talk
A
about
whole,
that for
a whole
hours. That's a
thing,
whole
yes,
other
it's
thing.
funny that this is both of our.
Both of our things,
Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, it
But
is.
the point is, you're supposed to come together with other people who are also mourning the loss of a loved one.
Yeah.
And come to terms with it together.
Yeah.
And we've lost so much. of
Maybe
that.
have a nice pastry while you're doing
Yes,
it.
you know what? Who
That
doesn't
seems
like a
fine.
good pastry? Have some hot chocolate, go visit grandma's grave, tell her all about your year.
That
Like,
seems
this
great.
is great.
Fine, yeah.
Yeah, do that right now, except it's cold and windy outside, but
Yeah, but it still sounds good.
yeah, you know, it just. Yeah, what a
Yeah.
weird way to end that.
Indeed,
Anyways,
yeah. Anyway,
to dust,
life
et cetera,
is short. And
Yes.
we're all tangible, yeah.
So I'm saying life is short, enjoy the pastry,
Yeah.
make yourself some hot
Exactly,
chocolate.
enjoy your pastry that you're going to say you shouldn't have this
Who
holiday
cares?
season. Exactly.
Who cares? You know what? We all end up in the ground. So what if I enjoy some donuts along the way?
Nice and bleak, Sarah.
That's the hay.
Yeah.
You're sitting in front of a mourning wreath, Tim.
Right,
We'll
I
talk
know.
about bleak.
I know.
All right. So before Zoom kicks us out entirely,
Oh my gosh, yeah.
yeah, that's been a whole hour. Wow. Anyone have any questions for Tim or I about the making of a hair wreath or Victorian mourning customs in general, or the state of the human condition?
Yeah,
I don't know how much we
there's
can.
questions here we could answer and questions we probably can't answer. So
The historian answer of, what a great question.
great question. Can recommend
As
a
we
book.
both instinctively like, yes.
Yeah.
a
Can
great
recommend a
question.
book for you. Yeah.
No questions. Come on, guys. I have so many, we could do a whole separate Zoom program on all of my questions.
Hi, are we able to speak?
Sure,
yeah.
of course.
So I'm not sure if this is a question you guys can answer. It's not directly linked to the wreaths themselves, but when you guys were talking about how customs can be used in current day and different technologies, and you guys mentioned the chatbots, it made me think of deep fakes. And would you guys ever associate those in the same way? Because it's similar to the chatbot, but it kind of is in its own. I don't know. Would you think that that would have been seen similarly, or do you think that that is something in our modern society that is something else that's very removed, if that makes sense?
That's interesting, and it's interesting you asked that because we're actually working our next. I can start saying this publicly. Our next exhibit is about misinformation in the 18th century during the American Revolution, comparing it to misinformation in the present. And one of the things we've been working on a lot with that is the idea of the deep fake. We want to highlight that. And I think the deep fake, and for those that don't know, I can kind of quickly say what it is. It is a taking words that a person didn't say and making it seem like that person is saying them. A very kind of, like having, name a celebrity, say these things, and it looks like it's happening in real time, and it looks like it's a thing they're saying that they never said. It can be, of course, applied to all sorts of things. But usually for the idea of spreading misinformation, but for a wide variety of other things as well. I think that's a really interesting question, because I think it is very similar to that, because it is ultimately having someone say something that, having them say something that there's no record of them actually saying, using information about them, right? Because you're taking like their voice, their inflection, the way they'd say something, their face, and having it do that. So I think they are related. I don't know if I can necessarily, I think that's very interesting to think about. I will say, I don't necessarily have that coherent of an answer to it, but I'm really going to think about it a lot, if that makes you feel any better. So thank you.
Thank you guys. It's just a thought.
Yeah, I like it. It's great.
These are the questions that we wrestle with, as we're so used to dealing with people that have been in the ground for 3 centuries.
I would prefer that, actually.
It's much easier to hate somebody that's dead and buried.
And just it's more fun to research them because they're not alive.
Sure. Yeah, they can't argue with you
Exactly.
as much.
Yeah. Okay.
On that note, so this will be up on YouTube. I can't promise when I will get this up, but it should be within the month or so. As a reminder, we do not have a program in December because the day that we would do it falls immediately on Christmas. So
I still think there's time for the Tim and Sarah holiday special. But
look, if you don't want to spend time with your weird family at home, you can spend time with your weird family here at the museum. Because Lord knows we are weird enough. So this still feels really unusual for me to say, but since this will be on YouTube, please do like and subscribe. Wait, no, like the video and subscribe to hit the notification bell.
It's kind of fun doing that.
I get why people do it. It's pretty satisfying. We want to make our programming as accessible as possible, so we will have captions. Everything will be edited,
which Sarah does, and I'm sure is really hard work, given how we talk.
No, it's pretty satisfying. The grammar nerd in me is actually, sit down, have a cup of coffee, just spend the afternoon just writing. Oh, weird.
Great.
Weird. You can also support us by visiting sicklemuseum.org/support. There are so many ways that you can help us continue to do these kinds of programs.
You could become a member.
You could indeed become a member. It is membership season. Membership also, by the way, makes a great holiday gift for the person who doesn't want more things. So you can get them something that is not a thing, and also support an educational, a whole series of educational programs, and also sponsoring an artifact or sponsoring a program or helping us to conserve the beautiful collections that we have, such as right behind Tim here.
You could sponsor conversations with the curator and we could talk about it every time.
You could. And we also have I won't say too much because we don't have details yet, but another spin-off series coming in 2025. Not to get weird and not to be real millennial here.
It's very millennial of us to do, though. It is.
Can you think of 2 better people to do this, though? Like, sure. Oh, we're gonna have so much fun. Okay, anyway, more coming. Thanks, guys, so much. We will see you not next month. We will see you in January. And January is something that actually a lot of folks have requested. So we are going to go back into Warehouse Valley upstairs, and we are just going to address some community questions and comments and the let's say wide diversity of opinions about Warehouse Valley. So listen, you guys asked, and that's really what we're here for, to give you guys what you want, answer your questions, and help us just understand each other better and understand what our community is. So we will see you the last Wednesday of January, which, if my calendar cooperates with me, will be January 29th.
Feels like a world away.
It does indeed. It will be a new year.
See you next.
It will be a better year because we will make it a better year.
I think it cut out.
There we go. Oh, all right.
Oh, did it? No. Okay. Oh, never mind.
Hey.
Well, Happy New Year, everyone. See you
How
next
is
year.
this? Support your local artifact. He is correct. We will also be starting up all of our Prohibition tour that's coming back in the spring. So lots of exciting things happening going into the absolutely wild journey that this will be.
Anno Domini 2025.
Look at you.
Mhm.
Look at you.
Mhm.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.